We're really fortunate this afternoon to hear from two families who are going to share their personal stories of transition, while doing their best to keep focused on enriching the quality of life for themselves, because we know how difficult it is when you're trying to help someone as well as trying to keep the person and your loved one in focus. So Richard Moore is going to share his journey with as both a spouse and an independent living resident. So he's continuing to live at Judson Manor while his wife has transitioned here to Crane House. Doug Wang has been both a son, brother, and he actually serves as the board chair of Judson Services. So I think it's good to hear his journey, and I think it's good for all of us to share feedback with him. And then finally, Corinne, who's our social worker, will share her insights just as how we work with the team, and then sharing some of the things that she has seen that have helped with some of these transitions. I just wanted to remind you to keep your cell phones on silent if you have a cell phone with you. We'll leave some time at the end for questions, so you'll be able to ask questions of anyone that's here. And then I know, I think that's probably the main, we do have some persons also who may be on virtual, and then they'll be able to ask questions via the chat room to Diana, so we might need to answer those. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start with you, Richard, and just tell me a little bit about how did you and your wife decide to move to Judson? How did that happen for you?
Well, first of all, it was identified for us by one of my younger daughter's colleagues who had wanted her parents to move there, but they wouldn't leave Virginia. But we had looked in Manhattan, where my wife, it's her favorite place to live, but we couldn't find any top-notch facilities in Manhattan. Then we also looked in Los Angeles, where our older daughter lives. And then we just came to, we were told about Judson Manor. And when I saw, Susan and I did not see it until we moved in, because but our younger daughter came and took pictures and things of that sort. And the first thing, one of the things that when people have Alzheimer's, I think, is often they like to see things that are familiar to them. And when I saw the pictures out the window, we lived in New York, and we lived across from Central Park, and we could see Jacqueline Kennedy Reservoir and the Metropolitan Museum. And then I looked down from Judson Manor, and there's the Cleveland Museum and the Lagoon and Severance Hall, just as an added benefit. And it was just really wonderful. And then we worked with the marketing person, Pam Travis, and she was just terrific. And originally we were going to be on the 10th floor, but it wasn't completed in time. And we were very lucky that it wasn't, because we just had this wonderful apartment on the 11th floor, which is the top floor at the manor. And then also it was just that we spent a good bit of time understanding what services were available to us at the manor, which includes, rehabilitation therapy, trainers, and then obviously all the food, which is nice not to have to fix your meals, is quite nice. And we moved in the middle of the pandemic. So for the first while we were there, all of our meals were delivered to us, things of that sort. And so we actually didn't meet as many people in those first months as we would like to. But it really was, we just, and the second thing was we had always, for a very long time had a great respect for the Cleveland Clinic. And so it was also nice to be literally 2 blocks from the Cleveland Clinic.
So So as you moved, were there any challenges that you saw? I know you came from Vermont to a brand new community in Cleveland. Things that were challenges, things that worked well.
Well, well, it's a big change coming from Vermont to Cleveland. But we left Vermont because the quote, good hospital was a 2.5 hour drive in the summer and a 3.5 hour drive in the winter. And we just knew that that couldn't be maintained. And that's why we started looking for a place. And, you know, the way we did the move is I followed the movers, and the next day, my younger daughter and Susan, my wife, came out. And what that allowed us to do is the apartment looked familiar. It had, you know, our living room furniture, our dining room table, pictures that she loved, things of that sort. And that really made a big difference for us. And it, you know, the adjustment was really quite good.
And then when did you start to think about memory care for Susan? Like how, I know you moved together, but how did that happen?
Well, it happened, first of all, it happened in Christmas 2022, when each of my daughters individually pulled me aside and said, Dad, you seem really stressed, and we think you ought to be thinking about memory care. Now, my daughters are very different. One is executive director of Women's Wear Daily, and the other is an Episcopal priest. You couldn't get quite more different than that. And I thought about it, and to be honest, the thought of not living with my wife, who I've been married to for 55 years, was really hard. And we'd known each other since we were 5 years old. And we lived in the same neighborhood. We didn't date, however, until we were both in graduate school. We came home from school, and as often happened in those days, almost everybody else was married. And Susan looked at me and she says, well, I think you're all that's left. And so in 1968, it was my daughters, and then I found out that my younger daughter had already begun trying to identify some places. And so then my next step was to go to our primary care physician in the clinic, and he voiced exactly what my daughters had said, is, you know, Richard, you need to think about this for both yourself and for Susan. And that was hard. That was hard. And we asked him, and two of the places that he recommended were Crane House and the park, which was interesting. But so that's how we got started.
And I know you had your two daughters. How important was it that you were all on the same page and journey together?
It was incredibly important. As I say, my daughters are very different, and but they're 8 years apart, and they are wonderful friends, and I think that's really helpful. But they're, like I say, they have different points of view. But we made the decision, which in retrospect was a really good decision, that each of us would visit the various facilities separately, you know, so that everyone could have time to ask their own questions, to think about what they would want, and it worked really well. And I had decided that I thought Crane House would be wonderful for Susan, largely because of the light. She's a sundowner, and the sunlight in their rooms, and it was just really, it just seemed right to me. And then, if anything, our girls were even more enthusiastic, and so that really helped a lot.
And so once you made the choice, what kinds of things helped in the transition? So what made it easier? Maybe what caused you to have concerns about the process if you did?
Yeah, well, the hardest part of the process literally was driving from the manor to here, because Susan has just developed, and we weren't aware that she had developed this fright if anything, any cars coming close, things of that sort. So that was a very long journey. But one of the things we knew was that Susan doesn't like to be alone. And so working with the team at Crane House, and we had meetings with the activities, the nursing staff, the social workers, all of those folks. So we had a series of 3 meetings over the first month, and they were very frank. That it was issues like, how often should I visit Susan? And they were. It was just those meetings were incredibly helpful. And one of the things we decided to do, that we didn't have to do, but we thought it would be a good thing, is for the first 2 months, we had aides 24 hours a day. And that was a bit expensive. But for the first while, they were in the room. And so she didn't feel alone. And then they started sitting outside the room for a while. And that really worked. And then, of course, the Judson team was coming in, the Crane House team was coming in regularly, as they would do. But it really helped, because then over time, she was very comfortable with following their directions. I didn't visit for a while, and then I'd come out, and she really has adjusted, I think, very well. Now, she's always been shy and always been a little reclusive. And so she has her breakfast and lunch almost every day in her room. And then she goes out for dinner at night. She absolutely loves armchair volleyball, and apparently is a real tyrant. And that's really fun to be able to have that. So really, it was just making sure she didn't feel left alone. And once we accomplished that, she's really been pretty happy. And well, yeah.
And I know it's always such a hard decision, but were there any things along the way that just helped you feel at peace? Like, okay, I did the right thing, was the right decision, like those aha moments. It was good.
Well, there is, and it's a strange one. My younger daughter lived in Cleveland Heights, and I had this intense, really, fear that she would feel that she needed to take care of me and my wife. And she's a very talented young woman. Of course, you would expect me to say that, but and she's been very successful as a priest, doing all sorts of things. And about 3 months after Susan moved in to Crane House, she came to me, and the church she had worked at in Oakland, California, had been trying for 4 years to get her to come back. And she came to me and she says, St. John's really does want me to come back. and I'll be associate rector, blah, 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 blah. And she says, how do you feel about it? And I have to say, I said, it makes me so happy that we now have created a situation where you feel like I'm okay at the Manor, Susan's okay at Crane House, and that you feel like you can now kind of move on with your life, you know? And I think that was the best indication.
And is there any advice that you could give to persons in a similar situation? And then thinking, is there anything, we as an organization or as a team could do differently that would help? Because I think that's always really important.
Well, I mean, my wife's mother had Alzheimer's for 18 years. And I was working and we were able to cover all of her costs for her. But as I thought about retirement, I realized that I might not have the same cash flow. And so we did buy long-term care insurance. And I think that was one of the smartest things we've ever done financially. And it, it has really been helpful. One thing I didn't realize is that once we started making claims on it, you no longer had to pay the annual subscription fee, but that was different. But that was one thing, and I think it was really important, and that was one of the best things we did.
And any advice you have for others or for our team that would just be helpful?
Yeah, I just think that the process, one needs to organize how you're going to approach it, how you're going to talk about it if you need to move in that direction. And again, every family is different, but for ours, it was really good that everybody was able to have their own independent inspection and views, and then we came back and shared them. I think trying to meet as many people on the team wherever you're wherever you're going to be looking is also incredibly important. One of the first people we met quite by accident was Samantha Wright, who's the activities director, and she's just wonderful, and she stops by Susan's room 3 or 4 days a week and kind of talks, and it helps keep her involved, and it's really good. And then, as I said, having follow-up conversations, which we had these 3 meetings with Brigitte, the head nurse, and all of the team, the activities team, the social team, all of those people. And being able to be honest with them about what your concerns are, and then allowing them to be honest with you as to what they think you should do. I just think that was probably one of the best things that occurred for us.
So I'm going to ask you one more thing that just made me think, while we were talking, but I know you had mentioned Susan's mother had dementia. Did you and Susan ever talk about, like, if something happened to either one of you, how that would work? Those are always hard conversations, but sometimes when you've had that experience.
We did. That was part of the process of getting the long-term care insurance. And so, yes, we did talk about it. And it also, it was sadly, because Susan and I had known each other for so long, I was able to see how her mother reacted in the early stages, and that allowed us to take Susan and to be tested maybe earlier than some people would have done, but it was helpful to know where we were and how we could get started.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And then we're gonna talk with Doug, and so I'm gonna ask Doug some similar questions, but how did your dad decide to move to independent living? How did that happen for you?
So, is it coming through?
It should, yep, you're on.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, my mother and father didn't travel as far. They lived in Pepper Pike to get here, and they followed with great interest the announcement and the building of South Rankin Circle. And I remember seeing this as a farm before. That would have been what, the early 2000s. Sadly, my mother passed away before he decided to come here. But it was always in their mind to sort of plan ahead as to where they wanted to be, and having a nice new facility out here in Chagrin was not a big move for them from Pepper Pike. And so he was happy. He was one of the first people to move out here in 2008, I think it was, and had a very good experience.
And was there any challenges leaving the Big Pepper Pike home to come here, or was that kind of a?
Well, I mean, one of the challenges always is you're going from a house and you have to downsize, and you have to leave things behind, and that was hard. It was also at a time where the housing market was terrible, so you didn't sell your house for maybe as much as you thought you were going to sell it for back then. But those were both overcomable. But I think just downsizing from whatever, a 5-bedroom house to a 2-bedroom condo was a little traumatic, and not every. One thing I've learned is my kids' generation actually doesn't want any of our stuff. So, you know, if you think you have nice old furniture, they're not.
Can you just tell us a little bit about your siblings? Because I think they impacted a lot of the things that happened over time.
So I guess the best way to describe my family is I'm the white sheep of the family. So I have a brother and 2 sisters. They all live not here. So I grew up here and have lived here most of my life. I have a sister in Washington, D.C., one in New York, and a brother who lives in California. I think one of the challenges for a family like this, and we're all very opinionated, is you don't live in the city, but you have an opinion, and sometimes it's not as informed as it could be because you're here for a couple weeks a year, you're not there for the day-to-day, and it was challenging. Like, we didn't always agree on, in fact, we didn't agree on a lot later on. Early on, my father was, fine. I think his memory didn't become an issue until 2016 or so. But trying to figure out what would come next. Like, so he drove for a long time, and not driving is one of the hard things for a child to try to do for their parents. And so one day I came out here for dinner with my wife, and he said, hey, like, a funny thing happened. I was going to go to Judson Park to visit my friend Gene Wyand, and I got lost. And he drove around for like 3 hours and finally found his way back. And like, I actually didn't think it was very funny because from Judson Park, it would have been very easy to go down the hill and it would have been very confusing. I was really happy that he found his way back, but was really concerned about him driving around. The deal was you could go to the drugstore and the grocery store and that would be it, but he kind of didn't follow that. So maybe I should admit this, but I took his car and I moved it to another spot in the underground garage. And then a couple days later, he calls me and says, well, my car's missing. And I said, well, Dad, you can't drive it anymore. And he's like, well, I could buy another car. I said, well, you could buy another car. I hope you don't, but you just can't drive it anymore. And it was a little bit of a source of contention with my siblings where it was, well, what about if he just drives to the grocery store? It's like, well, that was the deal, and now, it's time. There's always going to be a time where you probably shouldn't drive, and I'd rather stop it before something terrible would happen. If it was only risk to him. I guess I could live with that decision, but it was clearly risky for other folks. And so it was a hard decision to do it. I think it was the right one. He didn't buy another car. But it was hard. It was hard to do.
And what made you and your siblings start to think about, Crane House or memory care for your dad? What was sort of that journey?
Well, that contributed to it.
Yeah.
He also left the gas on one day and and his sense of smell wasn't very good at that point. And a security person was walking by and smelled it, and so then they turned off his gas. And there's not like a super bright line to know this is the time, but we started a conversation about it. And again, I think this is the other challenge of, it's in some ways it's easier when it's your spouse and you're making decisions. You have sort of 100% authority. It's very clear on how you're going to do that. When it's a child making decisions about their parents, it's a lot harder in terms of imposing something that, as they become maybe more compromised, you're not exactly sure what they wanted, and can they make that decision? And I think being here, I was further along in understanding that being in his home by himself wasn't a good thing. And he had a friend here, Jean Wyand, here for a number of years, but she predeceased him, and we were probably reliant on her unfairly for a longer period of time to sort of let us know what was going on. But sort of after she passed away, it was pretty clear he shouldn't be by himself. The challenging part there was he had a nice 2-bedroom condo with a little study, and so it was a bigger space. And the move to Crane House, you're going to a smaller space. I think it was hard for at least one of my sisters to understand. But I do think one of the issues, somebody once told me, as you get older, your world becomes smaller. And I think that's true. A 2-bedroom place was way too big for him. And Crane House was the right place. But my siblings weren't all along in the same way. And that was a challenge.
And I remember your siblings very well, and just wonder, were there things that, we could have done differently? I know we had lots of conversations about, separately and together. Do you think there's anything we could have done differently to help you all get on the same page, or did it just kind of happen after all those conversations, like it finally was the right thing to do?
Well, I mean, when he was finally ready to go, I was the trustee and the person who got to make the decision. So ultimately, I'd say it's better to have one person make a decision, maybe in consultation with others, but maybe have somebody who you really trust to make the right call, because it's a really hard call and families are going to come from different places. I would say that, I mean, the issues that I had with my sisters predates the issues that I had with my sisters in deciding this. And so I don't know that would have, and they're older than I am, so you couldn't have said, stop having children after 2. But, so it was what it was, and every family has their own challenges. I think you have to sort of accept it. And at least figure out how you want to have your decisions made, because at some point, maybe it won't be your decision or your spouse's decision. And you need to make sure you have somebody that you know has your best interest at heart and is, I think, realistic enough to know that this is the way the situation is. It's not one that necessarily we want it to be, but it's the way it is, and what's the right place for care. He started falling, the worry, what would be that he'd fall in his place and that we would find him for a long period of time, and that wasn't a risk that I was willing to take.
And I think over time, we know all your siblings were kind of got more on the same page, but would there be any advice that you would give to families, to children? Because like you said, it's much easier sometimes when you're the spouse and you're making that decision, but sometimes there's 2 or 3 or 4 children all trying to work together to come up with a plan. Any advice you would have?
I guess, I mean, there's not an answer other than I'd say, have the conversation with your family early while you are able to make, your wishes clear and how you want things to be done. And educate yourself on what are the things that come next, and your family as to what to say. There is this sort of, everybody has a fear of something, dying, dementia, whatever, and it's easy to kind of say, well, I don't want to think about that, but at least having the discussion, I think, is important, so that at least everybody kind of understands what your wishes are. Because ultimately, as his power of attorney, I'm there to sort of support what he wants, not necessarily what I want, and making sure that everybody knows what it is that you would like. I think it's important, but talking about it, I think, is important.
Thanks, Doug. And then Corinne, I know you've been involved in so many of these situations. So, when you first meet, a resident who's coming to you with concerns, or a family, how do you sort that out? Because sometimes it's not very clear what's going on. Tell us a little bit about how you help that family, that spouse, those siblings sort of get to the issue.
Yes, can you hear me?
Push the bottom and then it'll go green.
I think it died.
Here, is that?
It's out of power.
Sorry.
So one of the things that I always do is kind of start the conversation wherever the resident or with the family is. Because sometimes it's coming from, there's a whole lot of issues going on. So what's the main issue that's bringing them to me? And then from there, kind of peeling back, what are some of the other things that are going on? And to let the resident or the family, whoever's coming to me, to let them know that, my role as a social worker is kind of to try to help them and to guide them in exploring all of the options, exploring what the issues are, exploring what the resources are. I think one of the things that is really important to take into consideration is what is important to that resident, what's important to them. Because everything for every individual, it looks a little different. So there may be somebody who's coming to me and they're stating that, I need more supports in my household, but they're very concerned about, having others know that they need supports. Or somebody else may come to me and they're like, I'm very fearful of falling in my household. So what are the things that we can do to make sure that we're doing things that are going to be important to you, and then taking a look at what is the challenges, what's the resources out there, and what are the things that we can do. And resources are not only within Judson, which I think that is very important to explore all the things that are within Judson, because people don't know that, or they forget. If you don't use the service, you don't know about a service. But also, what are there other resources outside of Judson as well?
And I know you've guided a lot of residents and families. Is there advice you would give persons as they go through this process? I think both Richard and Doug shared there was a lot of steps along the way. So maybe what would be some of your advice?
I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give everybody is that everybody's journey looks a little different. And so to take that into consideration, I think sometimes people will get a lot of advice from a lot of different individuals. And so it's kind of exploring what is your journey, what's important to you is really important. And also to make sure that you're exploring all of the options and talking, they both said, talking, having those open conversations, those candid conversations that are very difficult to have, but it's really important to explore what each person's wishes and what they want their journey to look like, what they want their life to look like, what's important to them is really important. So making sure that you have those conversations. The other thing that I think is important is I talk to many different residents, different family members to really kind of re-explore those conversations as well. Having those advanced directives, having a power of attorney for healthcare, if you're unable to, explain what your wishes are is really important, but to revisit that because that individual may change over time. There may be, somebody may have their daughter, but maybe right now their daughter is going through, a situation or a crisis, so that circumstance may change. So kind of taking a look at that and exploring that and just, revisiting that because life happens, things change, so it's really important to just keep up with that. Thanks.
I wanted to open this up to any questions that you may have for our panelists. I'm sorry, turn this way, I'm sorry. I wanted to open this up to any of you who might have some questions for our panelists here today. Just there's things that you thought about or things that you might want to know. We'd be happy to take any questions. Any questions?
I want to thank you for coming, opening yourselves up like this. The question is, suppose the spouse doesn't want to go to the greenhouse. I gather in your case, that wasn't a problem. Some people just don't want to do.
Yeah, I think that's, we didn't have that issue. What we knew is that if she felt she were alone, so we could deal with that over time and bring it down. So we were very fortunate. The truth is, I don't think she knew that she was relocating. And again, what was so important was that the pictures we brought, the photographs we brought, helped her feel again that she recognized that, and that was I think that was critically important also.
I'm sure with most of us, if we have the choice, nobody wants to leave their home or their apartment. So I think those transitions are really, really difficult. I think we also know if persons move when it's a crisis or when they have very little capacity to adjust to the environment, it makes it so much more difficult. And so, there isn't any right answer to that, but I think in the experiences we've had, the persons that seem to maybe struggle the most is when it's, been a crisis, some event happens where there's no choice, or the persons maybe decline so much that they don't have much reserve left to adjust, and then they feel like they're almost being put somewhere. So I don't know, Corinne, if you have any more advice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I can say that makes the transition happen much more smoothly is for the staff to kind of get to know that resident beforehand. so that we can understand, what are the things that it's important to them? What's their day-to-day life and preferences look like to make them as comfortable as possible? Whether or not that's something like, I like to sleep in, so what does that look like for them? What's their favorite beverage? What are the things that they find comfort in? And that really does help to make that transition smoother. Also too, sometimes if there is like a home health aide or somebody in that household currently, to kind of have that person follow them for a little bit when they're making that transition, because it just makes it a lot more smooth, because they're recognizing, oh, this is somebody that I know, this is somebody that knows me.
Yeah, I've got this
Oh,
one.
yeah, go ahead.
I really want to echo that's what's important. And there was a form that we filled out before Susan was going to move in to Crane House, and my daughters and I took it very seriously, and all of her preferences, things of that, we filled it out. And one of the folks said, well, we wish everybody would take care, would spend as much time, because it really does help us know, and what food she likes, what she likes for breakfast, all those kinds of things are really important and really do help us.
It's, I'll just mention at Judson Park in the lobby, we keep a profile of each resident and kind of what things about them and what they like. And I can't tell you how many days, I'll go there, somebody else will all just kind of look, and these are a lot of our residents who are in independent living, but, just trying to think, do I know that about them? So I think that story is so important.
This one is, I probably could have done. This one is more really directed toward Crane House here. And if someone doesn't want to go there, what decisions does Judson make for somebody that's apt to be falling, or that they see having memory issues and making bad decisions and such, that are in independent living? That's number one. And number two, there are people here who probably, if all the things that we're talking about here really happen at Crane House, would benefit from going to Crane House, but they're very resistant because they say, oh, no, you don't want to go there. You just go there to die, or whatever. So what is Judson's role with the residents?
So this is always really hard. So when persons move in to Judson, and we are a continuous care retirement community, we hope that we're helping all along the way. But I think one of the times where we intervene, and we need to, is we always say, if it becomes a time and place where it's a threat to the resident's safety, or it is becoming difficult for the community. So in those situations, sometimes, to your point, we will have maybe a resident who is not aware of time and place. Like, we think, well, what if a fire alarm went off? Could they even get out of their apartment? Would they know where to go? Would they know how to seek help? We look at sometimes where there's residents who are reaching out to all of you every day, and we'll have people come to us and say, so-and-so is just knocking on my door every 5 minutes. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help. Those are situations where, we will begin meeting with the families, have care conferences, move along. Sometimes those go really smoothly. We try to point out things. We try to, share things that will work, put maybe some temporary things into place. And then there's times where we get to a point where there is no choice. And, that's, we don't like to get there. And, we've had a couple of those circumstances, you know, with maybe a child and their parent, where we have what we call a medical advisory committee, kind of sort of like an ethics committee, I guess. And, you know, it will be our physician and our nurses and social worker. And, you know, we invite the family as well, but just to share, here's where we are. And, you know, we kind of get down to, you know, maybe one choice or maybe two choices that will be safe. And the person, you know, needs to make those choices. And unfortunately, we never like to get there. We've had to go there, but I think what we try to do is have conferences, share information, you know, explain, you know, why we think someone is unsafe, you know, lots of, you know, security reports to us, dining, you know, housekeeping, so many different people share their observations, and that's how we help. So there is a time and place, and again, you know, that's just part of being in a community like this. We really don't want anybody to be, you know, unsafe. Additions to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, one of the things too is to invite the resident to explore Crane House, explore the other options. You know, sometimes people have a lot of misinformation as to what is life going to look like for me. And not to say that every transition is going to be smooth, but what I have found that many times the transitions actually are smoother many times for the resident than to the family. But you know, any transition in life does take time. So I also tell people, you know, give yourself time to adjust. You know, moving from an apartment, moving to your house, going to college, any of those transitions usually takes a person, you know, at least a couple weeks to a couple months to really engage and be involved and be in that process. So any transition does take time, but what I found is that most of the time the transitions go really smoothly, and many of the residents adjust into that routine much more quickly than sometimes their family is, recognizing that it was a good move.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank both of you, and certainly Corinne, for, you know, just being really honest and sharing your thoughts. I think it helps all of us. So we'll just give a round of applause for Corinne. And then I did want you to know that our last in the series is going to be November 9th at 4 p.m. And at this, we have Brittany Payne. She's an attorney, and she will be talking a little bit more about advanced directives, powers of attorney, you know, things for you to think about. Many of you already have all those documents, but I think she's going to share, you know, some wisdom there. So I think that'll be, you know, a great talk in the close of our series. So just wanted to thank you all for attending today. And again, thanks to all of you. I really appreciate it.